Grinling Gibbons is heralded as the most famous woodcarver in British history. He pioneered a naturalistic style that established his reputation as an exceptional artist. Why is Grinling Gibbons still such a cultural force in the 21st century? St. James's Piccadilly has invited leading curators, woodcarvers and artists to the church to answer this question face to face with his work: a reredos, a marble font, an organ case. I'm standing in front of this spectacular reredos that was carved by Grinling Gibbons in 1684. The decoration was sponsored by Sir Robert Gere, who lived in a house in Jermyn Street, which is a street just behind the church, and he also collected Gibbons's work. This is a wonderful example of Gibbons's work, and it's all carved in limewood, which is soft and it's easy to work. The reredos consists of 2 side drops and garlands on top, and if you look closely, you'll see different types of fruit and flowers. So you have crocuses, a rose, a tulip, plums and grapes. And there's also this pelican on top, and she's feeding her young with her blood, and that symbolizes Christ sacrificing himself.
Ada, this is a huge privilege to be here sharing this reredos with you and your knowledge. But can you tell me why Gibbons, what was his link with England?
Yes, of course. So, Grinling Gibbons was English, although he was born in the Netherlands, in Rotterdam, in 1648. His parents were English merchants, so his father was a London draper and merchant adventurer, whereas his maternal grandfather was a tobacco merchant in Rotterdam. And then he moved to England in 1667 when he was 19 years old, and that would suggest that he had his training in the Netherlands. When he arrived to England, he must have had advantage over some other local carvers, because Dutch training at that point was considered superior, and Dutch carvers were also trained in drawing. So when he arrived here, he brought that new fashion, new style of carving, and the drawing skills. That was something very, very important.
We were talking about a period when London had been devastated by the plague and the fire of London. Why did it attract so many sculptors?
Well, there were various reasons, and I think the economic reason was probably the most important one, because England became more and more important in the second half of the 17th century, whereas the Netherlands, the Republic, experienced gradual economic decline. So logically, lots of people from the Low Countries would come to England. And there, of course, there was the restoration of monarchy in 1660. That was seen as more like a symbol of stability. And Charles II, in fact, he issued an invite to skilled Dutch craftsmen and artists to come to England to settle with their families, and he promised various privileges to them.
And so I suppose the fact that the global trade was opening up and there's a huge amount of wealth created by that would have been part of the reason why he could afford to attract these sculptors to London, would it?
Well, absolutely, and also the patronage was much wider in England than it was in the Dutch Republic. First of all, the Netherlands, that was the Republic, so you didn't have such elaborate court, whereas in England, of course, you had the royal court, you had all these different aristocrats who had townhouses and had country houses that had to be decorated, and also the church in England was much richer than the more sober Calvinist church in the Netherlands. So artists and sculptors had more opportunities to get commissions.
So this is why Gibbons' theatrical ornamentation, embellishment was so popular. He was actually sort of able to project that scenographic image into the church environment.
Definitely, and I think that although in the Netherlands at that time there were people who could carve very, very well, but they didn't have an opportunity to create anything like that. That was just, I think there were these cultural differences. And here, literally, Grinling Gibbons could spread his wings and create something that in the Netherlands would have been considered very much over the top.
Because the ornamentation in England at the time was very floral, but it didn't have the exuberance of Gibbons. This is something that he developed and projected into the English style.
Yes, we are not aware of anything like that before his arrival in 1667.
I would say he lifted the mundane into the superb.
Oh, definitely, yes.
Yeah, yes. And this is just such a brilliant example of that.
Could you tell us how his style of carving evolved?
Well, I think it's because he came here from Holland with his Renaissance training, and he introduced lime wood to England, where oak wood was the dominant medium. And so he had the freedom to carve in the softer wood with the tight grain. The blonde colour, without the dominance of an oak grain and the medullary rays, means that the form of the carving and the modelling of it really has a chance to be appreciated. And then he put the light wood on the dark wood, so it all just shone out. And of course his genius at putting the life into the carving was just unique. Obviously, no man can carve this amount himself, and it was the age, I mean, nowadays, it's relatively recently that we've lost the workshop practice where you have a master carver with his team that he's responsible for, but certainly back in these days, he would have been the master carver in a workshop, which would have had everything from the apprentice that swept the floor right up to the journeyman carvers and the men that were ready to go out and run their own workshops, just champing at the bit to get away from this master who's dominating them.
Yeah, as you said, there's so many people working for you, but I still believe that he would then be the one who checks the quality, supervises the whole work, and provides drawings.
Yes, and I think Gibbons is also, he didn't necessarily just provide the drawings, but he would do the initial roughing out, because he had the vision of how it all had to work. So he would come in again with his stone carving ability, with a big chisel and a big heavy mallet, and he would just pound the wood out of the way, so that then the more delicate carving can be brought on by his team, and then he would come in like the master painters would come in and just do the finishing touches where he thought it was necessary. And I mean, there's such skill in his carving. You can see how something is quite crude and rough from one side, and yet from the angle you're meant to see it, it's just been finished to absolute perfection. So Ada, do you think that Gibbons would fit into the 20th century networking and forming his own brand?
Absolutely, and I think that's one of the reasons why today we only know Grinling Gibbons. Like, how many other 17th century woodcarvers can you name? And I don't think it's just because of his talent. Of course, he was very talented, he was incredible, and that's super important, but he was also an excellent businessman. He was so good at networking, he knew how to brand himself, and this is a very, very important aspect of his personality, of him as an artist, and we should not forget that.
So hugely confident.
He actually saw himself as a gentleman artist, and if you look at his portraits, you will never guess that this is a portrait of a craftsman, of a woodcarver. You would think it's a nobleman because he's wearing very fashionable clothes, silks, he has that huge wig. It's the kind of image he wanted to create, so people could see him as an artist, as someone very fashionable.
And Ada, how did he get started? What gave him the recognition? What was his first big commission?
Right, so the commission that he received that really changed his life, that was in the 1670s. That was a commission to decorate some apartments at Windsor Castle. Okay. And this commission was given to him, I think, via his friend, an architect, Hugh May, who had very strong Dutch connections. So I think that Dutch connection might have helped. And I mean, if you work for the king and you decorate his interiors, I mean, like, this is the best you can really get. But also, that was a huge project, and that involved working with various other craftsmen, different artists, different woodcarvers, and those people would have been exposed to his style of carving. And I think then they were really impressed and adopted it in their own workshops, and that's how the fashion for this kind of carving spread. So
that's William Emmett and Jonathan Mayne, is it? These are the people he was working with and influencing.
Oh yes, I mean there was a whole group of carvers, and there were English, there were also Flemish carvers who worked with Gibbons, sometimes for him, but sometimes as independent masters, but they were involved in the same large projects, and they could carve very well, and they adopted this style really quickly. And the result is that today sometimes it's very difficult to establish what's really Gibbons' carving and what is by someone else, but because people always know Grinling Gibbons, they attribute any good piece of carving to him. And in fact, Grinling Gibbons was a member of the Virtuosi of St. Luke, and that was a group of leading artists, architects, art lovers, collectors, and they met once a week during winter months, and then once a month during summer months. At various taverns in Covent Garden, and I am assuming they discussed art, but I think mainly they drank a lot.
And is there anything in the archive that can actually dispel the myths for us?
Not really in archives, but there are various myths around Grinling Gibbons, and I think the most famous one, and Hugh, I'm curious how often you heard that myth, is that his signature was a peapod.
Yeah, I've got a peapod here in respect, but
yeah.
And the myth is that it was open if the client was forthcoming with the payment, and closed if he felt it was going to be a struggle to get remunerated.
Yeah, so that's something you often hear, but it's not true. So a peapod was just one of various decorative motifs he used, and that was used by so many artists at that time. It was included in prints, so that has nothing to do with his signature. And I think another myth we should mention is that he did the whole carving by himself. As we've discussed, he had so many helpers, and there were journeymen working for him, and it's just not realistic to think that that one person did all the carving.
Completely impossible for a man to achieve that in one lifetime.
Yeah, because how long would it have taken you to carve something like this?
It would take several man-years. I mean, you'd need a big workshop to be able to accomplish that. So I suppose, depending on how many efficient carvers got in your workshop, you could then divide down 2 or 3 man-years into a shorter time span. But one person working on their own would certainly take, I should think, 3 years to accomplish something as complicated and elaborate as this.
Thank you. So why did Grinling Gibbons eclipse all the other carvers?
Well, I mean, we've talked about how he came to England and introduced lime wood, which gave him more freedom to express himself than the oak that was common at the time. But then, I mean, he just had the ability to understand how a piece was going to be viewed and to put the life into it. I mean, there's an Egyptian concept of ka. The spirit of the deity enters the effigy. And certainly Gibbons put the spirit of whatever he was carving into the effigy. You see it with the pelicans and the doves, obviously, because they are animate living beings. But then with the foliage and even the shells, which are, they're so realistic that, but they're not. You know, when you see them up close, they're a piece of wood that's been carved. But when you see it from the angle he's directed it to be viewed from, it exudes life. So, I mean, have you got names of the other people that were copying his style?
Yes, so there are many carvers working at the time who were working in a very similar style, and there were some who were English. So, for instance, Jonathan Main is really important, and he also decorated country houses and city churches. One artist I would like to mention specifically, Samuel Watson, because he's very well known for his carvings at Chatsworth. But the reason I want to mention him here specifically is because we know he came to this church and he drew these reredos, and the drawing by him survives at Chatsworth.
Okay, wonderful.
So this is an example that he really studied Gibbons' work. Why is Grinling Gibbons still such a cultural force in the 21st century?
Well, I think that it's an atavistic instinct to carve wood. I mean, everybody wants to leave their mark, and people just love wood because it is so comforting. It's where we come from. It's what heated us in the caves, and people want to appreciate these crafts and arts that are in our instinct. So it's very important for us as carvers to nurture that instinct and to help educate people that Gibbons is peculiar to his period and the circumstances that he developed out of. But then his style has persisted all the way through the centuries because it's so good and so inspiring. But it changes all the time, so no one has ever managed to carve quite the same as the Gibbons period carvings were.
Well, people should come to St. James's to see Gibbons' carving because it's one of his best, not just in London, but just generally. And also because this is such a high quality art and it's still in its original context, so you don't have to go to a museum to see it and pay for a ticket. You can come here free of charge during your lunch break and just enjoy the sheer beauty of it.
It is unique in his oeuvre that it's been restored relatively recently and the wood has been lightened up again. So often you see Gibbons' work which is just darkened with the age and the treatment that it's been given over the centuries, and it becomes a black hole. It just absorbs all the light and you can't appreciate the carving. So the fact that David Luard did the restoration, conservation here just over a decade ago now, wasn't it? And it means that we can begin to appreciate how Gibbons anticipated the work being seen when it was first created.
So now we're going to look at Gibbons' breathtaking marble font with its intricate decorations and carvings of Adam and Eve.
So we're here in the corner of St. James's, Piccadilly, looking at this wonderful baptismal font. And of course, within the church tradition, this is where babies and indeed sometimes adults are welcomed into the church and baptised. Has it always been here in this corner of St. James's, Piccadilly?
The font arrived in 1686, but it wasn't there originally. We think that originally it was on the south aisle, where the first entrance of the church was. Then it was moved, we don't know exactly when, but in 1822, there is a representation that shows the font in the middle aisle, in the central aisle, behind some seats. And then at the end of the 19th century, it was moved in the lobby under the tower. And it was surrounded by rails to make like a proper baptistry. And only after the war, when the church was badly damaged by the Second World War and air raids, it was moved and placed here, and this is its final location.
Yeah, so I guess it's always had that very prized location within the church,
Yes,
hasn't
indeed.
it? It's clearly an object that they have always highly valued.
And can you maybe explain what is carved around and the story of the font?
Well, yeah, in fact, the base of this is the Garden of Eden, wonderful trees and foliage and flowers there, but you'll notice a serpent winding around the tree, and that serpent has persuaded Eve to take an apple from the forbidden tree. Eve has been tempted, and look how she's offering the apple across to Adam here on the base of this. Now, why that is so relevant, of course, is that this is the moment where Adam and Eve fall from grace. They are expelled from the Garden of Eden. They can no longer be in this beautiful garden anymore. And in a way, that links to the whole idea of baptism, doesn't it? Because that's what the church is trying to do in baptizing children, is removing that original sin. Now, Grinling Gibbons has really picked that up on the font, has actually used another Old Testament story here in the story of Noah. And the moment that Gibbons has actually chosen here, you can see little rays of almost like holy light coming down from on high, and a dove bearing an olive branch to say that the terrible flood is over. So it's not just water as punishment, in a way it's water as salvation. God has saved these people to start again and continue that kind of idea of renewal. It's also quite nice, of course, that it's a ship, because we know that Gibbons began his career as a ship carver, but this is a much more rudimentary looking ark than the ships that Gibbons would have carved. As we move around the different stories, the next one kind of chronologically is a New Testament story. It's actually Christ being baptized by his cousin, John the Baptist. And it's really beautiful, and we can see it here facing out into the church. The third story on here is a really interesting story, moving through Christ into the Acts of his apostles. So it's a story of Philip, who is travelling and who meets on his travels a eunuch who is in the service of the Queen of Ethiopia, Candace. Philip realises that the eunuch is interested in hearing more about Christ, and in fact they decide that they will enact baptism right then and there. So this is another episode, this time of adult baptism, where we see one of Christ's disciples taking on the role of the Baptist. And I think what's quite nice about that again is that anyone in St James's Piccadilly who is actually the celebrant, who is baptising a child, is connected through this narrative, aren't they? Through sort of salvation, baptism, Christ himself, then the apostles or disciples being able to baptise, right through to religious members of the clergy now who are able to baptise both children and adults.
And do you know why the face of the eunuch is damaged?
I've really wondered about that, Kira. It's very deliberate, isn't it?
It is.
It's very specifically kind of attacking that face. I wondered initially, was it about him as a black man? Could it be an act of racism? But in fact, looking through the different iterations of the story, haven't found anything that specifically would identify him as such. I think it's maybe it's his sexuality. A eunuch, after all, is someone who has been castrated, and maybe that was a difficult subject for someone who felt they wanted to sort of enact that upon this terrible thing to damage a work of art. It shows that it still has power.
It does indeed, yes.
So all of this wonderful carving, but what do we actually know about the commission of this? How do we know that it is Grinling Gibbons?
Well, it's a very good question, because Gibbons did not sign the sculptors like most sculptors or artists at the time. First, we know that the font was given in 1696 by an anonymous donor who piously gave this font, which was not the original font when the church was built in 84. We know it is Gibbons because there is an engraving made by George Vertue called the Monumenta Vetusta. On this engraving by George Vertue, published in 1718, is also represented the font cover, and this is how we know exactly how the font looked like originally. And then there is also a drawing conserved at the Victoria and Albert Museum, which shows the font and the cover. And this drawing is partly colored with yellow representing gilt, and this is how we know that the cover was gilded. But the engraving was also used for other sculptors, and indeed in 1719, a sculptor from Lincolnshire, William Todd, produced another font copying exactly the engraving in this one in Maldon in Lincolnshire.
I love that. I love how artists learn from one another. Were there other copies of this? I mean, how unique is this object?
Well, there is actually another version of this font, very similar but not exactly the same, in St. Margaret's in Lothbury in London. But what is interesting is that the reliefs are really identical. So there was obviously a workshop practice and a workshop production in Gibbons' workshop. So probably what he did, he produced the design, the drawings. We know that Gibbons was a very good draftsman, and he probably designed the reliefs, and they were then carved and copied in his own workshop.
Grinling Gibbons is often accused of that, isn't he? And yet we know that all great sculptors had big workshops, all great artists. I think the vision, the moment of creation remains with the artist who gives the name to the work. But there's a whole team of people, isn't there, working around them, and I'm sure that's something that Gibbons would have made use of with this.
Some people say that he had actually up to 50 assistants in the workshop, and because he worked with marble, with wood, he had to have assistants and other carvers and sculptors specializing in each of these materials. So Gibbons definitely carved some of it, but it was common practice in the time in sculptors' workshop to have the master who designed, who made the original models, who made the original drawings and concepts and signed the contracts, and then to have the assistant who were carving the rough shape of the sculpture, or in this case the font, which is made of 2 blocks of marbles. And then he would have been involved in some details, maybe even in the tree, because we know that the stoning of Saint Stephen, which is at the V&A, shows a very similar tree. And this is one of the arguments that could also explain that Gibbons did carve some of this font himself.
In a way, I suppose, it's both that production line, isn't it? If you're a very successful artist, you need a lot of people around you to help you. But I'm interested too in that idea of how artists themselves are basing their own work on those who've gone before. How would he have learned about this and carving? Would he have looked at other sculptors, painters?
Well, he would have looked at painters and engravings, and maybe at the Royal Collection, at collections of models or plaster casts of engravings from classical sculptors or other Renaissance artists. Italian artists were very famous at the time and copied. And I'm sure the Royal Academy, there is a similar thing, right?
I was just thinking about that, actually. Our collection at the Royal Academy, we have lots and lots of plaster casts like you do at the V&A that artists would have used to train their eye and to think about how to learn to aspire to be a great sculptor. But what I do find interesting about the kind of plaster casts that we both have in our collections is that we don't have many by Grinling Gibbons. We have sculpture from antiquity. We think about the great Greek and Roman sculptors. We think about how the Renaissance kind of reused that interest. And I was thinking about it when we were talking about Adam, and we were talking about the way that he's standing, that beautiful contrapposto, weight on one foot. It's a very classical pose. So Gibbons is obviously engaging with that tradition. But somehow the generations that came afterwards, including at the Royal Academy schools, didn't really focus on Gibbons as an artist who'd gone before. Perhaps he became better known as a woodcarver than a sculptor.
Indeed, I think his woodcarving were really praised after his death, although he was a very famous marble sculptor in his days. In his own days, he carved, for example, a sculpture of King Charles II for the Royal Exchange, which was later destroyed. Unfortunately, some of his marble sculptures were either destroyed or were outdoors and damaged. He was assisted and he worked in collaboration with Flemish sculptors, the most famous being Quellin, but also John Nost later on. And this is one of the reasons why he himself is less remembered as a stone carver, is because there is some opinion that says that his assistants or his collaborators were doing most of the marble sculpting.
Do you think that's people were unwilling to let him be brilliant at wood carving and at stone carving?
Maybe indeed. It's but the figure and the decorative parts of the carving are really interesting. You can see in this wood carving that he probably excelled in decorative carving. And here actually the most beautiful part of the font are definitely the tree, which is fabulous, and all the leaves and the fruits and the landscapes. And these are the most interesting part maybe of the font. And could you tell us maybe about the people of interest who were baptized here in this font?
Absolutely. I mean, lots. But I've chosen two who were actually contemporaries of one another, but from very, very different backgrounds. The first is William Blake, who was baptized here in 1757, and there is actually a memorial stone to that. Blake, of course, was a student at the Royal Academy schools, and he went on to become a powerful kind of visionary artist. We're aware of him as a poet, as a printmaker, an engraver, a painter. But what's interesting to me is that the other figure who I thought was really interesting, who was baptized here as a 16-year-old boy, is Ottobah Kagwano, who was a huge force for the abolition of slavery, but within a context where he himself had been taken as a child, captured from his native Ghana and taken to Grenada. He worked for a couple of years there and saw and recorded in his writings some of the atrocities of slavery there. And then he was purchased by a British man who brought him to England, and he was then freed. He began to think about his experiences and to want to advocate, obviously, for the abolition of this terrible trade. But part of his freeing, if you like, was also how he turned to Christianity, and he was baptized here in this font. But I think what I found to be the nice connection is that William Blake was also in the circle around Ottobah Kagwano. And yes, he was. And part of that discussion among artists and thinkers and some politicians, Quakers, people in the churches, thinking about trying to change that horrific, abusive trade.
I think he mastered the art of decorative carving so well that he was really admired for his skills. And he's probably still admired for this wonderful carving he's made. And this is how he's remembered nowadays. And unfortunately, the marble sculptors are not really well known, but Gibbons is still an inspiration, I think, for wood carvers nowadays.
The Grinling Gibbons font is fantastic because, like a lot of his work, it's very, very intense. One minute you're looking at, say, for example, flowers or grapes or fruit, but it's more than just that. It's beyond carving. It takes it to an element and a stage where you can never imagine anyone could go. And that's the one thing I love about his work. Making sculpture is, for me, a sort of public art practice. It needs to be in a place. It needs to have something to say. And the context is very important. For example, the font over here, it works in this particular place, and it's about the religiosity, it's about the soul of the place. And I think that's really critical in the work of Grinling Gibbons. His work just exemplifies where you're at. It's not just looking at carvings, it's not just looking at fruit, it's looking at the space it occupies. And that is an extremely important thing for me as an artist. I can't just work in a vacuum, I need to be somewhere. So when you come into St. James's Church, you're in this amazing space by Wren, this fantastic architecture, which in itself is just phenomenal in terms of the way it's designed and the way the forms work and the light and so forth. And the centerpiece, the altar, is just so pure. It just works with the space. You might say, okay, well, on its own, it's a beautiful piece of carving, but here it's an altar. And that is the focus of the building. It's almost like a theatre piece. You're facing that direction. You're almost like sitting watching a play. And the fact that you look at all these wonderful shapes and constructions just helps you look at something that enhances the experience of prayer, enhances the experience of the space that you're sitting in. You're looking at the soul or the focus of where you're at. And I think that's what makes Grinling Gibbons' work so, so important. normally start my sculptures in a context. It has to work somewhere. I've just done a whole series of sculptures for climate change and visiting Calcutta, where I was born and grew up. So it was entitled Bengal. So I used a number of materials to enhance what it is I saw in India, what I felt was important about climate change, but without being too predictive or prescriptive about it. I wanted it to be something that you could, it's like being into the soul of something, and that's very, very important to me. So making a sculpture requires so many different aspects. It's the engineering, it's the scale, it's the materials, it's how far you can take it. And that's something that's extremely important to my practice as an artist. In St. Paul's Cathedral, I did these two massive sculptures which commemorate the First World War. And it's either side in the nave, practically under the dome. And it was very important that it sat well within Wren's building. It had to relate to it. So I used the lines and the shape and the texture and the detailing, which really, for me, worked well in the space. And in a way, it was a nod to Grinling Gibbons, because there's that sort of intensity in there. And it was that intensity that I tried to bring into the detailing of the sculptures, the destroyed buildings, the war, the conflict, as well as the pure shapes of the white crosses. And that wasn't just a nod to religion, it was a nod to people. And you know, St. Paul's, like St. James's Church, is a people's place. You know, lots of people come and inhabit this space. It's not just a place to come and pray, it's a place to come and be in. And it's about London, it's about the city, and it's how people connect to it. And so the sculpture has to occupy that. And I think Gibbons' work does that. It's very evident by the intensity of it. I was commissioned by Sharjah and UNESCO to provide a sculpture which was in front of the House of Wisdom, and that celebrated Sharjah as the World Book Capital in 2019. It was very much about the book. It was very much about the origins of the book, the scroll, something that's simple and spirals up into the sky. It was also a nod to Arabian calligraphy, something very pure, something very delicate, something that reaches upwards. And those huge monumental pieces that say 120 feet high was very much about reaching upwards. And I think that's something that a lot of great public art needs to do. It needs to take you somewhere else than where you're standing. And that is how I like to work as an artist.
So as a practicing woodcarver, the elements of Gibbons' work that really resonate with me are just the details are incredible. The way he makes wood look like stone, and it is such a grand piece. It's the vastness of it is incredible, and I can't imagine how long it would have taken to make. So even though Gibbons would have had a huge team working on this piece, the level of patience and skill and just determination to create such smooth surfaces yet beautifully tactile at the same time is just, it's breathtaking. You just don't really realise until you're up close the level of detail that he's managed to capture. So one of the daily challenges posed for sort of modern woodworking is knowing the provenance of the timber, making sure you're not chopping a tree down just to create an item. So I'm just really conscious and considerate of the environment and making sure that we use as many of the materials as possible. Also giving life to materials that may have been deemed as waste, and again that wouldn't have been a problem during Gibbons' time, as it was just about the opulence of the piece. So crafting and woodcarving techniques haven't really changed that much since Gibbons' time. In my individual pieces, I still use chisels, gouges and knives as the main sort of tools. My work challenges a traditional style of woodcarving by its tactile nature. Its everyday use is really important to me, and the connection to nature that we seem to have lost. I like to have items that are, that you can hold and use, but that allow you to sort of step away from the digital age, step back away from your screen, and being able to use these tactile, textured pieces and objects that can sit beautifully on your shelf or have a purpose and a function. I love that, it's really important. A woodcarver in the 21st century, to create a successful woodcarving business, we just need to have that connection to nature and not lose sight of the material's provenance. I think it's really important to know exactly where your materials have come from and understand that trees take years to grow, so it's about slowing down and really taking charge of the beauty of what nature is giving us. I think it's really important to be able to take beautiful pictures of your work, because the majority of our work will be seen through a screen. So to capture the nature of the tactile elements of it through a screen that makes people want to, to hold them, to touch them, that's really important and quite challenging. But through the use of pictures and videos, able to sort of tell a story with the piece that you're making.
The final Gibbons' piece at St James's Piccadilly is the organ case. And we are now going to view this sumptuous creation of carved and gilded oak.
The organ case does two things. It contains the body of the instrument, but it also provides a large surface for decoration. Organs have an ancient history in English churches. Decorated cases are more unusual. The great ones in cathedrals are well known, but to have such a grandiose case in a parish church is relatively unusual. In fact, by the middle of the 19th century, this instrument had become extremely dilapidated. It was restored at that point, as was the case, but since the wartime damage, the instrument has not been playable or active. That's a restoration project for the future. What makes Gibbons' organ case unique is its frankly incredible history. It was not, in fact, installed in the church at the time of its consecration in 1686, but arrived just 5 years later as a royal gift given by Queen Mary at the request, the petition of the parishioners of St James. It may not have the intricacy and the dazzling whiteness of the limewood reredos, but it has size, grandeur, and more than a whiff of royal scandal. The organ case was in fact created for the Roman Catholic chapel at Whitehall Palace. It was an astonishing project designed by Christopher Wren. The second phase of the chapel with the organ was completed in 1688, but this is a moment of rare and extremely fraught political and religious tension. The end of the year sees the arrival of William of Orange and the Glorious Revolution, and by the beginning of the new year, James has already fled to France. The Roman Catholic chapel, of course, was out of use as soon as James and Mary had left. By 1691, however, thought was given as to how its sumptuous fittings might be put to more appropriate use, and it's at this point that the parishioners of St James petition Mary for the organ. Mary makes the gift, and the organ is taken apart and moved across the distance from Whitehall Palace to Piccadilly by Bernard Smith, the other great organ maker of Restoration London. In fact, the move from Whitehall Palace actually saved the organ and Gibbons' work on the case, because if it hadn't moved in 1691, it would almost certainly have been destroyed or damaged in the colossal fire of 1698 that effectively destroyed the whole of Whitehall Palace. Once Bernard Smith had moved the organ and set it up here, it had to be checked, and that assessment was carried out by Henry Purcell, the great composer of the period, accompanied by Dr. Blow, another eminent musician. In many ways, Gibbons' organ case is not highly typical of his work. He completed relatively few church commissions. It does, however, look forward to one of Gibbons' greatest ever ensemble works, the double organ case at St Paul's Cathedral of 1695. It's also very unusual in that it's gilded. Gibbons preferred to use the natural tones of wood, especially lime wood above all. The organ case at St James's also marks an interesting step because it's one of the first works in which he makes very deliberate use of cherubs and cherub heads, which become a very well-defined part of his carving vocabulary from the late 1680s onwards and become almost one of the defining features of his work. The carving technique that Gibbons had used for the organ case is quite different from the limewood festoons of the reredos. Figure carving requires a different approach, and in fact it's very likely that Gibbons had sculpture specialists in his workshop to work on these life-size figures. Because they're fully gilded, we don't know the wood that he used. Figure work of this kind, ungilded, has been done in oak at around the same time, but he may have used other woods for these figures. The limbs and head would have been carved separately on the bench and then pinned, glued or doweled to the figure torso, which may well have been hollowed out rather than a solid piece of wood. Once the figures were complete, they would have been handed over to the gilder to be fully gilded in a separate workshop and then hoisted up and fitted into place. These would have been produced in Gibbons' workshop very much under his control. He was the boss, he was dealing with the client, so he is responsible for ensuring that the overall design and fit works perfectly. However, he's likely to have relied heavily on figure carving specialists in his workshop, a well-organised operation with apprentices and journeymen involved. Some of the floral decorations on the oak enrichments to the case may actually have been subcontracted to an independent workshop, but there was good money to be made in those, so Gibbons may well have had some journeymen or apprentices turning out that work by the yard and making a good profit as part of the commission. I think there are two reasons why Gibbons' carving style has stood the test of time. There's their very appealing naturalism, although in fact they seem more real than flowers or plants or heads might otherwise be. The second reason is that, like the best art and design, it works in two ways. It works from a distance and it works close up. From a distance, its form is immediately clear and convincing. It draws you in. But when you get close and you examine it closely, it's not so much about what it's doing, but what it is. It's the intrinsic qualities, the materiality of the carving, and the way in which a heavy material has been transformed into something light and airy, defying its materiality. Well, the kinds of people who were buying Grinling Gibbons' work for their houses, or at least the ones that we know about, because we have a very imperfect documentary record of activities, but those that we know about were the elite of society, the ones who could afford to spend large sums on building and fitting out an interior. Royalty, of course, as at the Roman Catholic Chapel at Whitehall, but essentially it's the landed aristocracy and nobility, or the institutions that were often guided in their commissions, like Trinity College, Cambridge, by members of that same elite. So the Gibbons' work becomes very closely associated with highest quality, status and luxury in the fitting out of interiors. Grinling Gibbons' work was fashionable in both religious and secular spaces. And I think part of the key to that is that they're both social spaces. Gibbons' work, however much it grabs the attention, isn't actually seen in isolation. It's part of a new approach, a Baroque ensemble approach, whereby architecture, interior design and performance, what goes on in those spaces, is united. The play of light through the windows in a church like this, the music emanating from the organ case, and the liturgical drama going on within the church, so that these things are interlinked, and Gibbons' sculpture is one of those elements, along with the rich textiles, even the fashionable dress of the people inside the church or the vestments of the clergyman officiating. It's part of a whole, and Gibbons' approach to that Baroque attitude, a new approach in England in the 1670s, 80s and 90s, is very integral to that overall effect. Well, people ought to visit St James's Piccadilly to see Gibbons' work, because here you have a fantastic opportunity to see it in context. Gibbons didn't make his work to be seen in isolation, and visitors can see it in the context that he envisaged for it. The richness of the moulded plaster and gilded ceilings, for example, that pick up so many of the motifs that we see on the organ case here, in the context of sound and music emanating from the instrument itself that Gibbons has decorated, in terms of the way the light falls through the windows, and this was always something that preoccupies carvers a great deal. Having light from the south side of the church raking across the carving defines the forms much more effectively than if it's coming flat on the front. So it's coming to St James, you get that full context. All the senses are employed in a Baroque interior, and that's exactly what Gibbons knew would happen and what he designed his pieces with that in mind. So if you get the chance to come to St James's Piccadilly, particularly during a service where there is the presence of other congregation around you and music in the space, and maybe if you're lucky you will get bright sunshine on a winter's afternoon coming through the south side of the windows and subtly illuminating the carvings, just as Gibbons knew would be the case, with lateral slanting light, just what every carver wants for his carvings to be seen at their best. That way you get the full multi-dimensionality, multi-sensory experience of a Baroque ensemble in performance.